Native Americans in the West were an interesting conversation at this time in history. We've already talked about the Fort Laramie Treaty, correct? When we talked about passage during the gold rush and that type of thing. And we'll kind of reiterate that a little bit. But the Native Americans were a big concern to the American government in the 1850s and so on, which really is our first subtopic, the Native American concern. But keep in mind that Native Americans were here first. Keep in mind that Native Americans had settled lands west of the Mississippi first. Keep in mind that we had moved Native Americans from east of the Mississippi to west of the Mississippi because we wanted them to maybe adapt to their own way of life there and be unhassled, so to speak, whatever. Okay, we've done this. We've given them this area. Well, when westward expansion happens, the gold rush and moving west, and all of that business, and life after the Civil War, when people had absolutely nothing in the South, because everything they had was destroyed, their feeling was, let's move west. Well, when they move west, it becomes an issue, it becomes a huge concern. So the Native Americans in the West became a major concern for the federal government about 1850. And that was during the initial time of what we know as westward expansion, when people started to move west. And we have talked about many people that have done that. Well, we gave them all this land west of the Mississippi River, right? Because we didn't want them east of the Mississippi River, right? Well, yeah, now we want to expand farther westward, and these Indians or Native Americans that are living west of the Mississippi are in our way again. Okay, they're in our way again. And the government's philosophy in 1850 concerning these lands west of the Mississippi was to conquer the land. What did we want to build across America? Railroads. And these Native Americans or Indians are going to be in our way. So the government's philosophy has changed to conquer the land west of the Mississippi. Because we're expanding, man. We're going to build railroads and we're going to expand. So with that thought in mind, who is the United States government going to use the services of to carry out this mission to conquer the land? The American military. Very good, dear. American military is going to be the ones that take care of this concern. Now, the United States Army had their own philosophy on the future of Native Americans, which consisted of two things. Okay, the United States Army had their own philosophy concerning the future of Native Americans. And it consisted of two thoughts. Again, this is important. The United States Army had their own philosophy on the future of Native Americans. Okay? And it consists of two things. We're either going to contain them or we're going to exterminate them. That was the United States Army's philosophy. We're going to contain them, and if they can't be contained, we're going to exterminate them. What do I mean by containment? Reservations. Giving them land in which they will live on. Now, how would you like that if all of a sudden somebody came in and said to you, well, you know, Brady, you got that place out there, but I'd kind of like to have it. You don't need it, so I want you to move over to Rawlins. And you're thinking, Rawlins? That's a horrible place to live. There's no mountains or anything, and I don't know where you live, but you have a nice place up by tent sleep, and all of a sudden I want that, so I'm going to tell you, I'll contain you. I got some really nice land over there by Rawlins. Yeah, you can have that, right? Yeah, but you wouldn't want that, would you? Well, you can't. But the point is, we're making a point here. That's containing. Well, Brady's going to say to me, are you kidding me? I'm not giving up this really nice land by tent sleep for this crappy land over by Rawlins. And so you would force me, if I could, and that was part of the problem, you would force me to exterminate you, because it was either contain you or exterminate you. And some got exterminated and some fought hard not to. Okay? And probably the best example of that, and the last example of that, was the Battle of the Little Bighorn with General Custer. Okay? Because that was his whole job when he went to Little Bighorn. Most people don't know that, was to put those Indians on the reservation. He didn't realize how many had gathered, and he was unsuccessful, to say the least, in his endeavor. Okay? So, with that said, we better know a little bit about the Plains Indian. So that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is the Plains Indian way of life. I want you to know exactly what it would be like to be a Plains Indian in the 1850s and 60s and 70s. The Plains Indian way of life. Okay, 3 things made up the Plains Indian way of life. Anybody want to guess what one of those would have been? Well, you're right. Freedom. We'll get to the example in a minute. Very good. Very good, Andrew. Freedom. In order to have their way of life, they had to have freedom. What else did they have to have? Well, they weren't land grabbers. They had areas, but they were nomadic, like Andrew said. So they didn't really claim anything. They just moved from place to place. What else centered around their way of life? What? No, nothing. What else? It's so easy you can't even get it. Buffalo. Yeah, buffalo. The way of life for the Plains Indian consisted of freedom, buffalo, and what? What were they really big into? They had their own spiritual religion. Very good. So, the way of life for the Plains Indian consists of 3 basic needs. Freedom, buffalo, and religion. The Plains Indian way of life could control religion, but in order to survive, there had to be abundant game like buffalo and the freedom to move where the buffalo were. So they could control their own religion, but they, as Andrew said, they were nomadic people. They lived a migratory lifestyle. Their villages were portable. They moved 3 or 4 times a year according to the direction of the buffalo. I'll repeat that. So, the Plains Indian way of life could only control religion. In order to survive the other 2 needs, they needed abundant game and the ability to move freely where they wanted. So, Plains Indians led a migratory lifestyle. They were a nomadic people. They moved from spot to spot. Their villages were portable. They moved 3 or 4 times a year, always in the direction of the buffalo. That was their way of life. Buffalo, freedom, and religion. Now, whenever they had a movement, one of those 3 or 4 times a year, they would have big-time buffalo hunts. And that provided the Plains Indian with anything it needed. Food and other things we'll talk about. So when they made the move to the buffalo, what soon happened after the move was a big buffalo hunt. So not only did the Plains Indian get meat from these buffalo hunts, but the hides and the bones and all those things were used for something. There was hardly any, if any, part of that animal that went to waste. They used everything for the most part. Everything. So the movement including important buffalo hunts, which provided the Plains Indian with the most of its food supply. I'm not saying they didn't eat other game, but they ate mostly buffalo. But the hides were used, the bones were used, the intestines were used. Everything was used on a buffalo. Very, very little waste. I would say there wouldn't be no waste, but the amount of consumption of a buffalo that was used in some way, shape, or form was very high. High. Okay? Any questions on the Plains Indian way of life, knowing the 3 things that made up? Speaking of religion, what was their big thing in religion? What did they have that westward expanders were going through? Burial grounds. Did they bury their dead under the ground? No, they lifted them and buried them above ground. and they had certain sacred areas where they prayed and buried their dead. And all of a sudden these Western settlers were coming through that and disrupting their way of life from the religious perspective. Okay? All right, let's tell you a little bit about what the role would be if you were a Plains Indian male. Okay, if you belong to a tribe of the Plains Indians and you were a male, this would be your role. Actually, the Plains Indian male had two responsibilities to his people. Not one, but two. Plains Indian male had two responsibilities to its people. First of all, they had the role of a provider, which would, what would be a more simplistic name for provider? Hunter. Hunter, okay? Role of provider, hunter. Or the second role that a Plains Indian male would have would be the role of a protector or a warland warrior, okay? So the Plains Indian male had two responsibilities to his people. One, the role of a provider or hunter, and one, the role of protector or warrior. Now, we got 100%, right? 100% of a person's time. Brady, what do you think the percent of time that a Plains Indian male spent as a provider?
75.
Pretty good guess. Actually, it was 80. So 80% of the time spent by a Plains Indian male was spent as a provider or a hunter, and 20% of his time he served as a protector or warrior in most instances. So again, very good, Brady. 80% of a Plains Indian male's time was spent as a provider or hunter, and about 20% of his time he served as a protector or warrior. Now, if you were a young male, you were under the care of your mothers and grandmothers until you were 5. Once you turned 5, you began training for the role of a protector and a provider. So you were coddled, maybe would be the word, until you were 5 by your mothers and grandmothers. But once a Plains Indian male turned 5, they began the training to become both a provider and a protector for the tribe. And they would be trained from the age of 5 to about the age of 15. And if you were a Plains Indian male at 15, you were very proficient in both your roles as a protector and a provider. You were ready to roll at 15. About a 10-year training period in which you learned those particular roles. Have any of you seen the movie Dances with Wolves?
Yeah.
Well, you can see examples. I'm going to show you that movie because I think it's a great movie talking about Native Americans. And it shows a young boy that hasn't quite got 15 yet that's still learning the trade. You'll pick all that up. So, you were trained until you were 15, and at 15 you were very, very, very proficient. So let's talk about the role of the Plains Indian male as a provider or a hunter first. How were you trained as a provider or of a hunter? I think you'll enjoy this. Anybody know what the bow that was used by Indian hunter was made out of? It was made out of wood. What type? Yeah, that's true, but it had to be a wood that would be hard, because otherwise it would break. Anybody know the wood it was used if they could find it?
Oak.
Oak. Very good. Oak. So, the bow used by the Plains Indian hunter or provider was made from a very hard wood, such as oak. And it was shaped in the shape of what they considered the new moon. You ever seen a new moon? What's it look like? Is that what a bow looks like? Okay, so for the most part. So the bow was made by a very hard wood, usually oak, and the bow was formed in the shape of what the Indians referred to as a new moon. Anybody know what the arrows were made of? Wood, but what type of wood?
Cedar.
Willow. Very good. Made out of willow. And a hunter's arrow was designed with 3 feathers. 3. Why?
Why?
Why did it have 3 feathers? Would it fly with 2?
No.
Oh, it would fly with 2, no doubt. Fast, actually. Why'd they have 3? Why'd a hunter have 3? Accuracy. Any bow hunters in here? Do you have a guide arrow? Do you have a different colored arrow that you put in your guide? That's exactly the same philosophy here. So these hunter arrows came with 3 feathers. One that would be used as a guide arrow for good accuracy. Okay, it provided guide for aiming. Because when you're hunting, is it important you have a good aim? If you're a bow hunter and a good bow hunter, your number 1 rule of thumb is not to wound an animal and have him suffer or whatever. You want to have a nice accurate shot through the heart, you bleed them out and they die. That's important, okay? So because proper aim is important when hunting, a 3-feathered arrow provided a guide for aiming. Now, each arrow was marked by color. Why would they put a color on their arrows? Possibly find them, but also to identify whose arrows were whose. Okay, you want your arrows back, right? So especially on a buffalo hunt, right? You'd want your arrows back. Okay, so these Plains Indian males that were using the role of hunter marked their arrows with a color or marking so they knew which arrows were theirs. Because they wanted to see which hunter made a kill for that family. Anybody know what the arrows' heads were made of originally? Stone. But what were they later made into? This is kind of interesting. They went away from stone to what? Metal. Where'd they get the metal? Mainly. What? Americans, but from what specifically were they always looking for? Any of you girls gardeners, do you have those half barrels that you plant flowers in? Anybody have those half barrels?
No.
What keeps the barrel together? Steel ring, right? So barrel hoop metal is what they really like to make the metal tips for their arrows. They would find settlers brought everything in barrels. And those barrels are kept together by the iron ring that goes around the top and the middle and the bottom. And those were prime materials for the Plains Indian males to transform their arrows from stone to metal. Okay? Anybody know how long an arrow was?
3.5 feet.
Depending on the person that was firing them, because they went from the elbow to the tip of your finger plus a hand. That's how they measured them. From the hunter's elbow to the tip of his finger plus a hand. So my arrow would be that one. Everybody's was different, yep. Elbow to the tip of your finger plus a hand. Now, which way is vertical?
Up and down.
Hey, is this vertical or is this vertical?
First one.
Really? Okay.
That's vertical.
This is vertical, isn't it?
That's horizontal.
Oh, yeah, okay. These were so, vertical. The arrow points in an arrow tip was vertical in the arrow. Vertical. Why would it be vertical?
You want the shoot straight.
Well, if it's up and down like this, if you're an animal, which way are your ribs going to be, like this or like this if you're an animal?
Like that.
This, aren't they? So would that vertical go in between the ribs? Okay, there's the difference. So the arrow tip was vertical, so it would penetrate the animal between the ribs. Now that wouldn't be the same for a man, would it? No. We'll talk about that.
So it would be if you're more.
Well, if you're down, yeah. Now, this is kind of interesting. There was a difference between a hunting spear and a warrior spear. And what were these hunting spears used for? To bleed out an animal, right? To bleed out an animal, okay? During the hunting season. Now, a Plains Indian male that was a hunter had several different strategies that assisted their success in hunting. Okay? Maybe you do this when you're hunting. Maddie, we'll see. When you're on foot, do you go in a disguise when you go bow hunting? Yeah. Camouflage we have today is what they used in different, they obviously have camouflage, but they would disguise themselves wherever they were at. What'd you say?
That's about
Well, maybe, yeah. They disguise
it.
themselves.
Small bow.
So when on foot, the Plains Indian hunter wore disguises. Kind of like the camouflage philosophy that we have today when we're hunting on foot. When Plains Indian hunters hunted buffalo in the winter, where'd they like to run them so they could kill them easier? What? Not yet. In the winter.
Oh, really deep.
Into really deep snow to bog them down. And what did the Plains Indian male hunter, how did he get to the animal then? Of course, snowshoes. Very good. They used everything. So during the winter months, the hunter would use snowshoes to travel across the deep snow, and they would pursue the buffalo in deep snow to kind of bog them down for easy kills. Then we'll get to Brady. Either on foot or by horses, when they got them later, they would run those buffalo off high bluffs or cliffs, and they would basically kill them at the bottom, and then the women would be at the bottom of the cliff taking care of the kills afterwards. That's how another strategy they had. Now, when they got horses, what was the goal in killing a buffalo when they got horses? Run them what? Not so much, you're close. Run the devil out of them. Run them and run them and run them, and then shoot them, because what would happen? What?
They were exhausted.
And they'd bleed out. You know, your blood's pumping a lot faster if you go run a 440, and if you get shot in the stomach after running a 440,